So we know the movement's happening, but how do you find your baseline? How do you even begin to plug into these global frameworks? So we're going to start mile high first. We're going to start kind of a little bit in blue sky, and this is the way I like to think about these frameworks. We're going to start with Project Drawdown. So Drawdown is the kind of brainchild of Paul Hawken, who wrote The Ecology of Commerce, who has been consulting Interface on their sustainability and impact since 1994. And it is 100 of the most, it's the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, not mitigate it, reverse it. And there's 100 solutions, and those 100 solutions have all been, there's criteria. They have to be available and scaling. There has to be a business case. They have to have the potential to reduce GHGs by at least 50 million tons over the next 30 years. The negative results, the unintended consequences, have to be less than the positive outcomes. And there has to be sufficient data to be able to model these technologies at global scale. And I say technologies, but they're not all technologies. And I think sometimes in the world of impact, we do get a little bit lost in technology sometimes. So here's some of these solutions. Drawdown of the 100 solutions. The number one here, the number one solution is refrigerant management, creating better refrigerant management. Number 3 is reduced food waste. 56% of all the food produced in the world is actually goes to a landfill or compost. Number 6 is educating women and girls. Number 7 is family planning. So these are mapped, modeled, scaled. They actually broke those two categories up, women and girls education and family planning, because they didn't want it just to be women were responsible for saving the world. They didn't want that. But basically, this is a framework that you can look at. There's a website. Go to the Drawdown website, look at those 100 solutions, and inevitably, not every company and your activities will be represented, but a lot of companies' activities will be represented. If you're in agriculture, Dave, health technology, I'm sure that's represented somewhere on the list. So go to the list, learn to use these tools. Sorry, I'm getting a little notice. So Drawdown, it's just kind of an exciting brain twister of impact. It will surprise you. The second framework we have that's kind of coming more down to earth are the Sustainable Development Goals. They started, as the Millennium Goals a long time ago, and they finally became the Sustainable Goals as we understand them in 2015, and they are the world's to-do list. And a great way to look at them is the grid. So we're seeing companies all over the world really using the Sustainable Development Goals to communicate the impact they're creating. Unilever is a great example. Unilever is communicating their impact to investors, to shareholders, to stakeholders through the use of the SDGs. And I think regardless of what your business is or your portfolio is, you can look through these tools and figure out, okay, maybe I want my portfolio to align with 13 climate action, or maybe my company maybe we're meeting number 11 and 12. So they're a little bit less detailed than maybe we want, but certainly more detailed than Drawdown. And a great way to look at the Sustainable Development Goals to really I found when I saw this next graph, courtesy of Hayden sent this to Brianna and I. When we start to think about the SDGs this way, there's biosphere, society, and economy, it makes it a lot easier to understand, and I find a lot more accessible. And really, when we're working with companies, we're kind of thinking, okay, how are you meeting these goals at each level, at the biosphere, society, and economic level? And so quick breakdown of the SDGs, and there's going to be time for questions, and the B Corp certification, which to us is really the only tool to measure total value creation within a company. It measures, it's growing. Right now, we have 100,000 plus companies have used the BIA, the B Impact Assessment, to measure the impact of their organization. We only have, well, not only, it's been growing fast, 3,301 companies. This is as of like 2 days ago. We just heard 3 more certifications came through in the last 2 days. So that's exciting. 150 industries across 70 countries, and they have one unifying goal, and that is to use business as a force for good. But that's a lofty goal, and it sounds great, but what does it actually mean? And I know this is the challenge. Like when we talk a lot about, we hear a lot about greenwashers, and I think we have to give them some love and say maybe they're doing it because they simply don't know how. And so the B Corp certification, whether you do it with a guide like Decade or you do it on your own internally with your team, every question ask yourself is, how would we do this, and why would we do this, and how would it work? So every no becomes a how in that certification. There's about 90 different certification tracks. I believe there's a total question set of around 2,000. I know Danone had 1,500 questions in their assessment, and we've worked on assessments where they only had 120. So there is a vast question set based on your region, your industry, your size. Now, and what it measures though, the nuts and bolts, or it measures impact in these 5 key areas: governance, workers, community, environment, and customers. And through the measurement, and I'm just getting all detailed, and I hope that's okay. Through the measurement, basically it helps you as an entrepreneur or an investor understand what the impact business model is. So if you're making money and doing good, this measures how much good is in every dollar. If that's to me, that's kind of the easiest way to put it. And it unlocks all of these different areas. So governance, for example, in the governance area, it's going to measure mission and engagement, ethics and transparency, governance metrics. But the impact business model is that critical piece, and that is in this governance area, it's mission locked. So what that means is that you've changed your articles of incorporation as a company to take into account stakeholders. And there is language that we use with all of our companies that is from B Lab, that works for us as Canadians. So each of these areas, like workers as an example, you're measuring a bunch of different pieces within the company and things that you wouldn't normally put on your balance sheet. Certainly not as a revenue center, probably as a cost center. But the impact business models there are worker ownership and workforce development. So going through the assessment can really help you understand where the opportunities are for impact, and then how you measure it. Community, measuring all kinds of things, but the core pieces for that impact business model are producer cooperative, local development, and local economic development is, I should put there, maybe not local development. Supply chain poverty alleviation, designed to give. And now we get into environment. And environment, there's lots of impact business models, and they may seem like a little bit inaccessible. As an example, land and wildlife conservation. If you're a fishing company and you only catch sustainable fish with sustainable methods, you would be in a land and wildlife conservation model. If you are an agriculture company, or forget it. If you're a baby toy company and you're using organic materials and toxin or toxin-free materials to make those toys, you'd be that toxin reduction and remediation model. So these are, it's kind of down the rabbit hole a little bit, but once you get familiar with the certification and start to use it, these things make more sense. And customers, in the customer side, you have your customer stewardship, which is important, but many organizations, an awful lot of service-based organizations, your impact, it comes from the companies you serve, the companies and customers that you serve. So I feel like another way to communicate how the B Corp model works is that if when they built the model to lock mission into companies and help them really understand how to move the needle on impact, they were really, they tried to determine what it means to be a B Corp and where they should put that threshold, where that threshold should be. And so it's a scored certification, it's points, a little bit similar to LEED. But if you score around a 40 or below in the B Corp certification, you're very much like business as usual, old school business. If you're scoring like kind of 50 to 60, you're probably an organization that has a corporate social responsibility baked in some way. Now, in order to achieve a B Corp certification, you have to get 80 points. So that means you're really beyond CSR. You're really beyond the corporate social responsibility, and you've really moved into this real impact space where something is being left better than it was found. Now, I feel like we have questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen because now it's time for questions about this. Okay. Do we have questions? I welcome all of your questions.
Christy, we had a question earlier from Leslie Duncan. Leslie, please elaborate if you'd like to. The question was on how prominently does gender inclusivity fit into the ESG perspective and measurements? And perhaps you can speak to the different tools that you just mentioned.
Yeah, okay. So I'll speak mostly to B Corp because I feel like it's the most nuts and bolts. Gender, diversity and inclusion, not just on gender, just all diversity and inclusion is baked in throughout the certification. So as an example, like organizations that are managed by women, those are points, those are pointed. Organizations that have diverse boards of directors, those are baked into that certification. They're also baked into the customers too. Not only like, are you serving customers, but what kind of customers are you serving and what's the problem you're trying to solve? So from the governance level of, are there women and people of diverse backgrounds at the table making decisions from that boardroom, all the way down to who's being served by this company. Gender does play, gender and general inclusion plays into it. Do we have another question?
I have one more question from Tanya earlier. What do you think about the spirit of certifications versus actually attaining them?
I think that in terms of B Corp, I think the spirit of the certification, it's nice to feel the spirit, but you should get it. And if you, it's basically like, who said it? There's no verification like a third-party verification. So that is the only kind of global third-party verification that you do what you say you do. And in a world of full of greenwashing, even if it's because they don't know how, that's really, really important. And when we see like that those Angus Reid numbers, 86% of consumers are going to buy based on how companies reacted during COVID-19, a lot of those things you would see companies doing, they're measurable in that B Corp framework. So I think that saying you're good, that's fine. But in my mind, the rubber meets the road when you actually work towards that certification. I know, and that's specific to B Corp. I know we've seen companies come in with like, I'm going to get 100, and then they're like at 50. But that doesn't mean they stay at 50. It's a journey. Do we have other questions? I feel like there must be. Someone must have a question. We had so many unsures about Drawdown and the Sustainable Development Goals. Does Frank have a question?
We have a couple more questions that have just shown up on the chat.
Okay.
So how easy is this for startups to implement? And perhaps what is the easiest starting point for startups to consider the first steps and priorities for these types of measurements and certifications?
I'm just reading these questions. So in terms of like the government resources to help do evaluations, there are ways to access resources through training, to go through training programs to help you understand how to use the B Corp certification. We do lots of that work actually with our clients. So there are resources that exist. It sometimes feels like putting a square peg in a round hole. But I think that's just because the government doesn't quite yet know what to do with things like this. Like they know they want impact, they know they want sustainability, but they just haven't gotten there yet. But there are some resources.
Yeah, and I can add to that from the perspective of foresight and what we're looking into there. The discussion that I had with Jeanette at Foresight when you and I started to talk and figure out how we can make this concrete, that there is definitely an interest to figure out how we can include some of these considerations when we start designing business models. And so when entrepreneurs actually look at their whole business model canvas, they can start considering, okay, so if we want to consider impact, how would I look differently at my supply chain? What is not right in the supply chain, and what should improve? And clearly, you know, if you look at agri-food, it's an extremely dysfunctional supply chain right now. So that needs to be redesigned. And it's things like that on the customer side. Maybe, you know, what gaps are we seeing in terms of what service that customers aren't getting that they need because of changed circumstances? So together with Foresight, we will be following this webinar, starting to plan some workshops to discover. But it's really, like you said, Christy, it's the starting point. We have to figure this out, or we want to figure this out. We're ready to take the first steps.
Thank you, Frank. We have another question from Peter. How easy is it for startups to implement? I guess the short answer is it's the best time to implement this is in startup, because the way and I always have to say at Decade, the way we deal with the certification is we use it as a design tool. And so designing these processes within companies and designing these initiatives for companies. And so the challenge there is that sometimes it's hard to turn a dinosaur. It's hard to turn a big ship. But if you're in a dory with your startup, it's a great time to implement the B Corp assessment and use it, especially because it really helps you develop the suite of policies that are required to create the kind of guardrails for your impact and how you measure and how you are going to create impact. All those questions are going to make you respond to different scenarios. So I think that is a great time to do it, is actually in startup. And we have a question from Chad. How do you address the fact that a company can be as regenerative and sustainable as they want, but currently bureaucratic barriers obstruct many of those efforts? Okay, i.e. building codes. Does B Corp offer any support in changing regulations that are actually destructive to sustainability? That's a big question. Chad, I feel like you just unmuted yourself.
I did. This is one we really struggle with. My team creates sustainable communities. And the fact of the matter is that if you live in Canada, you're almost forced to build unsustainably. They throw in massive delays, decade-long delays in some cases, and all sorts of barriers that cost monumental amounts of money to overcome. So although these are the legal things that are required, they're completely immoral and, you know, unjustifiable in our current climate.
Yeah, you know, that's pretty hard to.
Yep.
One thing that is happening within the B Corp movement is that there's a ton of advocacy happening. So, you know, organizations are creating these coalitions within the movement to advocate for better regulations. We are, and I don't know, maybe we should actually have a conversation offline about your particular challenge, because we have been working in the kind of construction, between construction and industrial, and so there are things happening there. But yeah, you know, I'm actually hoping that COVID, that the government responds to COVID by moving really quickly to change some of those regulations across the board, not just in the built environment. But even the concept of like embodied carbon is just something that the government is just starting to think about. Yeah, so I think B Corp, within the B Corp movement, you're surrounded by a bunch of people that are progressive and want to see regulations that actually work for creating an inclusive economy. But yeah, we still have to deal with bureaucrats. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I can't give you more, Chad. Monty, same challenge here. Dave, as a startup founder, who in Vancouver can I talk to if I want to begin setting the company on a path to B Corp status? You could certainly talk to us at Decade, Brianna or I. You can talk to, there are other kind of consultancies that do similar work to us. Like, we're not the only ones. And we actually have some programs that are going to be launching soon. And one of those is basically a B Corp boot camp. And we're hoping to have a lot of like startup companies represented there. So we could send you some information on that. Yeah. Oh, can I speak to how B Corp creates value for companies and investors? Certainly. Companies want to know what they're really made of, I think, and investors want to know what they're really invested in, especially as we move through these changing kind of these strange days of COVID. I think that what we are, oh, sorry. I'm going to stop looking at my chat. On the investor side, I think on the company side, to me, that's really simple. It's that you know what you're building. You understand what you're building, you understand what it's made of, you understand your blind spots. Because if you have to go through and answer between 100 and 500 questions about your business and how it functions and what policies you have in place, it really gets down into the details of how to build a company that's going to leave it better than you found it. To me, the case for the B Corp certification using it within companies, even if you decide you're never ever going to get the certification, is incredibly useful. From the investor lens, you know, I think it's important to know what we're invested in, and your portfolio, it's your legacy. So of course I'm like all heartstrings about it, like do the right thing, but also we're proving that doing the right thing is profitable. And in that the GIN report, 1 in 3 investors were making those impact investments because of the return, not in spite of the return. So just taking a little bit of a dive into understanding in a little more detail, just a few aspects of the certification, but not just the B Corp, but just impact generally. I think for the B Corp assessment, these are the kinds of things that you need to understand about your business. How much revenue is generated from your impact business model, your environmental impact business model? What are your carbon emissions? What's your water usage? What's your waste creation? What kind of equipment do you use? What kind of materials do you use in your products? And do you use chemicals? What kinds of chemicals are they? And so in each section of the B Corp assessment, it does go quite deep into these questions. And the environment section is getting bigger and bigger, which is a very good thing. And just as a quick factoid, just to help create some context, is this was one of my favorites. The internet's energy and carbon footprints are estimated to exceed those of air travel. So one of the things we hear all the time when we work with companies is, oh, well, we're a digital company, we don't really have a carbon footprint. Or yeah, we just, it's not a part of our impact. So, and this just, we try to make clear that, like, even if you don't think you have impact, you have impact in all of these areas. It's just maybe smaller or larger than the company next door. Supply chain. We hear a lot of our clients in our sessions with companies and in our training sessions, we hear, oh, I don't have a supply chain. Like I don't have a supply chain. So we love the banana. We think the banana is a very clear way of communicating that, well, everybody has a supply chain, and the supply chain is kind of like the iceberg of impact. What you see sticking out of the water, that's just that is the tip of the iceberg in terms of your supply chain impact. Underneath that water, that's all of the value that's within your supply chain. And just to help bring that home is in a McKinsey report, this is basically looking at sustainability factors and supply chain for consumer packaged goods. So as we see, we think we're going to have 51% growth in this company. But if you look, the carbon emissions, air pollution, child labor violations, all of these little mosquitoes that are picking away at your profitability, this is all the stuff that you clearly understand when you lean into the B Corp certification and you do it and you really push it to its limit. You will understand all of this and have transparency about all of this, about how your supply chain works, energy usage, and what have you. And on supply chain, because we're in COVID, and it's important for us to be really thinking about how it just feels like all our supply chains are contracting, and we're trying to bring them closer to home now. We're trying to build regional supply chains rather than these international supply chains right now. And this is a great example of Mills Basics. They're a B Corp certified company here in Vancouver, and Loco BC did an economic study with them a few years ago. And as you see, if you spend $1 at Office Depot, 1 cent stays in the community. If you spend $1 at Mills Basics, 33 cents stays in the community. And that doesn't seem like a whole lot. But when you get into some supply, we've worked with quite a large company in Vancouver, and they're spending around $120 million a year, and 80% of that is being spent. More than 80% of that is being spent locally. So that is a huge, huge, huge economic boost to our community. And so it's really important to start to think about supply chain risk, not just as like not knowing what's in your supply chain, but also like, how do you bring that supply chain closer? I think about the dog bed company in Burnaby that now makes N95 masks. Right? They're just, we're trying to bring those supply chains closer to home so that we can manage them more efficiently. And finally, like a risk factor for companies generally in the time of COVID is employees. Not only employee safety, but morale and performance. So this Great Places to Work report, unlike a lot of reports, it actually has Canadian content in it. So we really like this report. And the 5 key predictions for the best workplace cultures are less top-heavy management, nurture an entrepreneurial spirit, let people off their chains, let them work, diversity and inclusion. I forget who asked, I forget your name, but diversity and inclusion, a huge driver of performance, and a deeper sense of purpose. So that purpose, that's impact, that's your BHAG, that's all that. And advanced data and analytics, like that, I know everybody feels like that has to do with technology generally, but I'm going to lump in impact measurement into that data and analytics because that's where it should live. It shouldn't live like that. Measuring impact within a company shouldn't live in like a CSR, like an impact, community impact person. It should sit in finance. So that I think that's really important to understand, that this isn't something like designing and managing impact in a company isn't something you necessarily give to the intern. Sure, interns are great and they can help you, but this is a C-suite. These are C-suite propositions. This work should be done with decision makers within the company. That same report shared some interesting stats. The one here on the right, I find very makes me feel like my job is I'm working for everybody. So this is basically looking at Fortune 100 best places to work companies and their returns, as opposed to other in the Russell 3000 and Russell 1000. So companies that are creating inclusive, impact-driven workplaces are seeing higher returns. And finally, I had more slides on this, but I didn't know what our time would be like, so I took them out, and I'm sorry. Inspired employees. So Harvard Business Review in their research, they found that the most inspired employees are also the most productive. So inspired employees tend to be 225% more productive than engaged or satisfied, just satisfied employees. And we see a lot of that actually has to do with purpose. That inspiration comes from purpose and from really good leadership